marketers and finance people like high margins, so you ought to be able to agree on something at least. What else? Market objectives. We want to develop a presence in this market, that market, the other market. Not every organisation is based on commercial gain and commercial profit. We've got plenty of charities out there. We've got plenty of membership organisations have to make profits, but
yeah, we're a non-profit.
You know, but actually, I'd be astounded if you're really a non-profit organisation, because I bet you like to make profit. You just reinvest them.
Yeah.
So you're a non-dividend organisation. I get that's one of my rants about non-profit. But nevertheless, the way you're going to make your objectives is going to feel a bit different than some of these hard-nosed commercial types. You're a hard-nosed not-for-profit type, and that's a different thing altogether. And you know, if you really are a charity, then your objectives are measured into are things like, you know, the take-up of ideas, or the benefit of people. It's one of the problems of a not-for-profit business, and especially in the charity sector, is getting objectives that you can actually measure. Because it's simply no use having objectives if you can't tell whether you've achieved them or not. And you've really got to watch that. You might have noticed I've written that word up there. Yeah? Are you going to please tell me you know what that means? Objectives should be SMART, which stands for specific. Yep. Thank you. That's the one. You'd be quite astounded how many people write in their assignment, one of our objectives is to gain greater market recognition. How much market recognition? How are you going to measure it? It's not a wrong objective, but you haven't told me the whole story. Measurable, must be measurable. Why measurable? Am I not just being pedantic? No, not really, because I want to be able to tell whether we've achieved the objective. And you can't tell whether you've achieved it unless you can measure it, because otherwise you'll be arguing forever as to whether you've achieved enough increase in market recognition, unless you specified it beforehand. What else is there? Specific, measurable,
Achievable.
Thank you. If I can spell that one. Achievable. Like, as President Kennedy said in 1960, we're going to have a man on the moon by the end of the decade. He was pushing it, but it turned out to be achievable. Skip R for a second. T.
Time-bound.
Time-bound, yes. By when? Do we want to call it time-bound or timed? So not only do we want to achieve this much more measurable market recognition, but we want to do it by this date. Okay? And the reason I've left the R out is we might have a couple of contributions. What do you think R stands for? Realistic. Any more? I'm not trying to play too much of a game here, but I've just heard various different things for the letter R here. I've got resourced, and I've even forgotten what the third one is. I didn't write myself a crib on it, did I? That would be handy. Blast, I didn't. Realistic, resourced. Doesn't matter. It's either realistic or resourced. I'm not convinced whether realistic and achievable are the same thing, but I'm not convinced whether anybody recognises that resourced is an option as well. In other words, have we got the means to do it? These are almost, I'm not quite sure if they're the same or not. I'm not going to fuss too much about it. But please, when you put your marketing objectives into your marketing plan, make them SMART. Otherwise, you will get a comment from your tutor saying, come on, make them SMART. Chances are, if you can discover what your corporate objectives are, there's a very good bet they won't be SMART either. And that's worth a comment as well. See how our objectives, our marketing objectives for this marketing plan sit within the corporate framework. But by the way, please note that these corporate objectives aren't actually SMART. I can see half a mark just for free, just for saying that. On the other hand, you might want to say, and see how SMART our marketing objectives are and spell it out. But I don't think you have to do that. If they are smart, I think the examiner will say, okay, they've made it smart. Yeah, it's a question of how much you want to spell it out for the examiner. But don't make them not smart, otherwise I should get very cross with you. And it happens. 30% of you will forget to make them smart, or you give a list of 5 objectives and 2 of them aren't smart. I get very cross if you do that. And they, again, just the other one, innovation, quite a popular one in some circles. We want 30% of our sales every year to come from products that are less than 1 year old. So that's in the context where innovation means new products. Of course, innovation doesn't have to mean new products. It can mean all sorts of new things. The other thing to note about these different types of objectives, especially objectives at different levels, they may have different time scales associated with them. On the whole, your corporate objectives tend to be long-term ones. Short-term tactical plans tend to have short-term objectives in, obviously. You're being asked to write a medium-term plan, so again, it might be worth a comment, even if just in your own heads, just to note that different objectives have different timescales, and the objectives of your marketing plan are going to be in the 1 to 2 year range, and the corporate objectives are 3 to 5 years, and so they don't have to contribute completely to fulfilling the corporate objectives, but it's all got to fit together, and it might be worth a comment about the timescale of the different objectives. Good. So that's about objectives, and that's about the hierarchy of objectives, and that's about SMART objectives. What does this say? Yeah, it's worth checking, and we'll do this again when we get to the end of the planning bit. Sometimes, in real life, because objectives are supposed to be achievable, and you're sitting there, despite all my remarks last time, you're still in a darkened room with a wet towel over your head because you've done the audit and you brought the audit into the room with you. You're going, what objectives should we set ourselves? And you're saying, well, it'd be nice to do that, but we might only be able to do that, and I can't tell whether we should set our objectives here or here. In real life, you might very well find that you don't set your objectives until you've written your plan. Because when you've written your plan, you get a better idea for what's achievable and what's realistic. And the whole point is it's got to join up. So don't feel too badly with yourself if right at the top of the plan you can't work out what the objective should be. Maybe give yourself an ambitious objective and a safe objective. See how the plan feels like with those 2 objectives in mind, and then by the time you've written the plan, you realise you're going to have to spend this much on developing new stuff and that much on hiring 3 new marketing executives and all this. You can see how much it's going to cost. You can tell more reasonably which objective would be achievable and which one wouldn't be achievable. So there's 2 remarks to be made there, but in particular, by the time you've finished, the plan has got to be consistent with the objectives and should contribute towards the corporate objectives. And the plan needs to be compatible with all the other resources and skills and constraints which you have learnt by doing the internal audit. So the whole thing's got to hang together. It is simply no use having a plan which calls for 50 man-years of development expertise, and you've only got 3 people in your R&D group, unless you've got a plan for subcontracting it and spending all that money. But the plan doesn't generate enough income to spend all that money. That's a silly plan. It doesn't all tie itself up. So make sure it's all tied up, and make sure that the plan shows that the objectives are achievable and is consistent with the objectives you set. And you might find when you've written the plan, you may need to adjust the objectives a little bit because the plan turns out not to be workable. I'm sure I could have said all that in about 1/10 of the words, but I hope you get what I mean. Good. We'll check that up again at the end of planning. While we're at it, and while we're on marketing objectives, and while we're on strategy, let's have a quick pause just to make sure, I bet you are, but let's just make sure we're all familiar with Mr. Ansoff and his matrix. Can I go over here with that? It's a somewhat misquoted piece of marketing wisdom, but I'll give it to you in the popular version, the popular misquoted version, and just for fun, I'll show you what the original context was. But Mr. Ansoff says there's really only 4 ways you can develop your business strategically. And this has an impact on the sort of objectives you want to set as well. And Mr. Ansoff says, doesn't he, if we do a 2x2 matrix, does anybody mind if I put products at the top or markets at the top? I never remember which way. Doesn't much matter. I tend to keep on getting this wrong, but let's just suppose it's products at the top and markets along the side. And if anybody tells me I've got it flipped wrong, then flip it yourself. New, existing, and new. Mr. Ansoff says that there's only really 4 things you can do, although they do subdivide somewhat. We can focus on selling our existing products into our existing markets and getting more market share. Yeah. This is called, as I'm sure you can tell me, market penetration strategy. Yeah. There's lots of ways you can do it. You can try and win share from the competition. You can try and encourage people who don't buy at all to buy from you, thereby increasing the size of the market and gaining share that way. You can encourage people who buy to buy 2 or 3 at a time instead of 1 or 2 at a time. You can encourage more repeat purchases. So there's all sorts of ways there's all sorts of different flavors of market penetration strategy, but they all amount to getting a bigger slice or more sales from existing products in existing markets. Really relatively low risk, because we don't have to learn about new markets, we don't have to learn about new products. And for many companies with some Asian bits of the market opening up, they amount to the same market as the home market. There's a great opportunity for many companies to increase sales substantially by moving into Eastern European and Far Eastern markets at the moment, provided they count as extensions of the same marketplace, to be discussed. Depends. There are 2 other strategies. You can guess what's coming, can't you, really? We could decide to take our existing products and sell them into what amounts to new markets. And guess what? This is called market development strategy. So it might be, it's usually a different application for a product, or it's a different set of different set of customers who might be geographically in the same place, but they want to do something different with the product. There's all sorts of ways that we can imagine finding new markets for existing products. Or we can say, no, hang on a minute, we don't want to go to the trouble of developing and investing and developing relationships in new markets. We want to stick with the markets we know, but we're going to serve them by making different products available to them. And guess what? This is called product development. So it was such hard work to develop our relationships in these markets, and it's such a fertile place, and they've got such a lot of money to spend. If only we could add these other products to our portfolio, we could develop and grow our business that way, and that's called the product development strategy. Both this and this are a bit more risky than that, because here you've got to take the risk of new products, and depending on who you read, the statistics say that a large percentage of all new products never take off when they're introduced to the market. So better not do that. So down here, you've got all the risks of developing relationships in new markets and learning all about the different requirements in different markets, which might be in strange places as well. And that's all of a sudden much harder to do than you thought, so whoops, we better not do that either because it's too risky. Better stay there because it's safer. So relatively safe, a bit more risky, and of course this is just completely balmy. We're going to throw it all away. We're going to develop new products and sell them into new markets straight away. That's called diversification. I can't fit it all into one box. Diversification, which simply means we're going to develop new products and sell them into new markets at the same time. You'd better have a compelling reason for doing that, because you've got both the sets of risks going at the same time. This is regarded as a pretty high-risk activity. Of course, if you're a little startup company, you have no choice because you don't have any products or markets, and that's why new startups are a risky proposition, because you don't even know how to do products or markets because you haven't got anything, and you're having to be in that box straight away, which is why new companies have to work extra hard at this. But luckily, they don't have too many costs either, so we can manage. And so what Mr. Ansoff is saying is you've actually got these 4 sorts of strategies. That plays out in the strategy section of your plan, but it also affects your objective setting, because clearly we've got different sorts of objectives here, because this is in market speak and that's in product speak, and this is in market share speak, and so forth. And this is another favourite, and if you want to talk about your strategic approach, it's really comforting to know there's only 4 things you can do. And so as long as we pick one of them, then we know we're safe and we're intelligent. You can pick 2. Don't feel you have to do a bit of everything. But all the examiner wants from you is a little discussion. We're adopting this approach for these reasons. To respond to this opportunity or that threat, we're going to do some of this. And that will affect the way you set your objectives and the sorts of objectives you might set. Now, by the way, just out of interest and way off syllabus, this is a conventional view of Ansoff's matrix. It turned out, and I only learnt this myself not long ago, that when Mr. Ansoff did it, the subject was, and don't write this down because you'll just blow your minds, the subject was this. Ansoff's original paper is about diversification. He threw these in as all the boring things you can do instead of diversification, and this subdivides into about 16 subsets. And it really was a paper on diversification. And one of the textbooks out there somewhere goes into hideous detail on that, and I got myself into an almighty tangle trying to explain it, so I backed right off from that. For practical purposes, let's take the old-fashioned, the conventional view. It's these 4 things, and actually these are the 3 interesting ones. But if you read your historical stuff, it's all about that. So there we are. Thanks to, what's his name? Laurie Taylor for pointing that one out to me, just in case anybody's asking. Good, so that was Ansoff and objectives. Those were objectives, those were tying up the loops. Good, let's just spend a little time on the other subject of interest in this section. Just recognising, and we're starting to get towards the audit, but not quite yet, but the sorts of ways that the external and internal environment the sort of influences they can have on the way you'll set your objectives, the way even you might configure your organisation, and of course what we're getting to in next session and the one after is the direct impact on all these things on the plan in general through the audit. But the following is quite an important thread in the whole module, that planning, objective setting, organising companies, all this stuff. I don't know whether I should say can or should, both are true. Should be driven by what's going on outside and inside the company. We don't just do it in a vacuum. And we'll have the idea in a second, in fact we'll come to it first, this thing called the resource-based view of the organisation. What does that mean? It means if you look inside your organisation, you've got a lot of stuff going on. You've got a lot of assets, you've got a lot of people, you've got a lot of competences, you've got a lot of skills, you've got premises, you've got processes, you've got a whole lot of stuff, some of which works, some of which doesn't work. I was amused by a conversation over tea when somebody here referred to an individual within their organisation not merely as a weakness but as a threat. There's all sorts of stuff going on inside organisations, and given that we are making our plans in the real world, we had better take this into account. The sorts of things I mean by internal influences, and forgive me, I think the set of foils that you downloaded might have an extra one on there, which was on there by mistake. Internal influences on the way we do things. This is all fine. I'd like to tell you a story. I spent 7 years of my life working for a Dutch company. I only had one product, and that product was an enormous box of very clever electronics and optics. You might be able to fit 3 of them into this room, but that'd be tops. So whacking great box of stuff for printing the circuits on semiconductor chips. Yeah, so mainstream stuff for the semiconductor industry. It was for those who want to know about this stuff, it was optical lithography. It's a process by which you put the wafer, because silicon chips look like that when you're building them. You put the wafer into the machine. It's a photographic process, just like an old-fashioned 35mm slide projector. You project the image of the circuit onto a photosensitive material on the wafer. Bang, there's your circuit pattern. You go off, put it through the chemistry, and you make your real-life silicon chips that way. These boxes, at the time I was involved, sold for about $2 million each. And you tended to sell them 10 at a time, if you're lucky. So scary numbers of zeros, and a very scary business, because that was our entire business. And we were competing in particular against 2 Japanese companies, because by then, when the story is told, we'd already beaten the Americans. We were quite good at it. And we were playing against 2 Japanese companies, one called Canon, of whom you might have heard, and one called Nikon. And what do we know about Canon and Nikon is they do things like cameras and photocopiers, and they've got lots of other stuff in their business. We didn't have that stuff. And it turned out in particular that Canon, because this is the monster, this is the whopper company. It was 2.5 times our size just for this bit of business, and about 1 million times our size because of all the other stuff they did. They didn't, our reading of it was that they didn't actually care whether they made a profit or not out of selling these bloody great boxes of stuff. They did these bloody great boxes of stuff so they could learn about how to do really, really, really good optics and electromechanics to spin off into their core business of things like cameras and difficult cameras and photocopiers and all that. And they simply didn't care if they made a loss, I'm exaggerating a bit, on this business they're called steppers, these photolithography things. Whereas if we made a loss doing it, we went bust. 2,000 people went home. And so the way, you can imagine, the way they plan their business is kind of different from the way we planned our business. Not because there's anything different about the world, the external worlds, because we're both selling into exactly the same market. But because of the way they were organized, they could be much more aggressive on things like price cutting. They could be much more aggressive on giving away, they gave away free samples. Here's a 2 million box, have it, dear customer. If you like it, come and buy some from us. You want 2? Have 2. We couldn't do that. That's £2 million out of our back pockets if we did that. So the way the 2 businesses behaved was really different because the internal world, the resources available to both, they had an unlimited pot of money in reserve. We didn't. And it caused plans to be different. It caused objectives to be different because the internal context was different. Now that's a fairly, and by the way, the other Japanese company was twice as big again, but had to rely on making a profit out of this division because Nikon wasn't as big as Canon and all the other stuff, and so they were a bit more sensitive to making a loss. So it's a little easier going against them, but the Canon were really, really hard to compete against. So what? Yes, so the stuff you've got inside your business is going to affect the way you make your plans. If you've got a bunch of really clever engineers, you're going to want to use them to do really clever designs. And you'll be a little less ambitious about really clever designs if you've got to subcontract it or you've got to find resource from somewhere else. I met in this very room a few years ago a company whose business at first sight seemed quite mundane. I said, his name was Anthony as well. He said, what's your business? He says, we repair lasers. Oh, yeah? And he went on a bit. We can repair any laser on the planet. I said, oh, yeah? We've got the drawings and the parts lists for every laser on the planet. I'm going, that's interesting. Do you realise what you've got here? I don't think you realise what he got. Again, he might have been exaggerating, but nevertheless, he had got, over the years he built it up, information about more or less every laser on the planet. And I don't mean these tiny little diodes, I mean these industrial great things. And because he had that extraordinary resource, I'm assuming that was difficult to get hold of. I don't know how I would get hold of drawings and parts lists for every laser on the planet. I think it's hard to do. Because he had this extraordinary resource, he was able to set out his stall and make his business plan this way. He could take on an awful lot. You'd have to be very specialised to be better than him at almost anything you did in laser repair, I think. But because they had this extraordinary resource, they were able to drive their business differently than if they didn't have it. So what are we talking about? Yes, so here we are, available resources, available capabilities, the way we are governed from on high, all affect the way we're going to set our objectives and the way we're going to set our ambitions. So it's really important when you're doing your plan to make sure you're having a look inside your organisation and taking account of it visibly so the examiner can see that you're doing it when you make your plan. Not difficult to do. In practice, when you do your audit in the assignment, there will be an external section and an internal section. And when you write the plan, it's quite okay, as often as you like, to put in brackets, because of this, brackets, C audit, we're going to do it this way, brackets, C audit, you can refer to and fro, and that's how you show the examiner you're taking all this stuff into account. You can also say in your plan, if we were a larger organisation, we might attempt to do it this way, but because we're a smaller organisation, brackets, C audit, we're going to do it this way. Because we've got this extraordinary competence in this area, because of these three key individuals, whoever they are, we can do it this way. If we didn't have that, we'd have to do it this way. And by the way, when we come to critical risk factors down the bottom, we're going to have to work out what happens if one of these three people leaves the company or goes under a bus or something. This is a sort of discussion the examiner likes, because you're taking into account how it is in your organisation and how that translates into the way you're setting your objectives and making the rest of your plan. And this is the idea of the resource-based organisation. Your organisation as a set of resources, for my money, and assets and competences. So you need to make sure when you do your audit that you're telling that story, and we'll talk about the internal audit next session or the session after. And for me, it is one way or another a story about your resources and your assets and your competences. Good. External influences, a bit easier maybe to see. A bit easier to imagine, maybe less easy to see, because you've got to go out there and have a look in order to see them. This is 2011. Not quite as bad as 2010, but still pretty bad when it comes to economic conditions. What do we mean about economic conditions? If you were a consumer organisation, dear old consumers like you and me are a little more nervous about spending their money, those of us who have any, than we used to be. Sorry, remind me, who's selling to consumers, to individuals? Not many. Consumers, who's selling to consumers? Sort of, partly, bit. Bottom dropped out of the market, or not? It's not obvious. Apparently the premium brands are still doing very well. Don't quite understand that, because even people with premium amounts of money are feeling the squeeze somewhat. But they seem to be growing like topsy. Don't understand that. But people are spending money, let's say, differently. Business to business, not affected by this, of course, is it? Ha, ha, if only. Businesses are even worse about spending their money because of the economic conditions, the patterns of behaviour and the things that clients, companies, businesses want from you is changing. because money is tighter, you're having to fit much better with what they want, and it's going to change all the things we want to do because of the way the economic conditions are. Nobody can borrow money anymore. At least it's a lot harder to borrow money, so people don't want to fund their purchases. It also means your company can't borrow money so easily, by the way, so you've got to pay more attention to cash flow than you used to. Who knows where we're going on exchange rates and euros and all the rest of it? Anybody do business in Greece? Keep your heads down. Don't rely on that for a bit. Love to talk with you about Portugal. Tricky. And we hear that Spain and Italy are next on the list. Help. No. But this is happening. We personally can't do very much to change it. We've got businesses to run. We've got businesses that are doing business in Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, Russia, China, Indonesia. Which is an interesting one. Thailand just finished their elections. Sister of Chinawat just got elected. No experience, Prime Minister. What the hell's going to happen in Thailand? If we do business in Thailand, how's it going to affect us? Don't know, but for sure as heck, it affects the way we're going to plan our business. This intimately affects the state of the marketplace, of course, because if customers don't want to buy, it all goes conservative. There's much less discretionary spending. Everybody wants to buy. What's it go? I lost the phrase. They only want to buy. They're only going to buy things when they have to. Their criteria for purchase decisions is mend and make do. There's a lot more of that. The markets are, on the whole, depressed. It doesn't mean you can't sell anything. It means you've got to work harder to work out what your customers actually want from you. What else? If you're up against entrenched active competition, that's going to affect the way you make your plans. The way we made our plans as a business, that semiconductor equipment company, was intimately affected by the behavior of those two whopping great Japanese competitors. We spotted, the market leader was Nikon at the time. For a while we spotted they had taken their eye off the ball when it came to customer service. We tried to exploit that as much as we possibly could, because we noticed that they lost focus. And we said, opportunity for us. We were the number 3. We had only 10% of the market, and we needed much more than that. And we moved in quick when we thought we saw they'd taken their eye off the ball. Industry life cycle. Not too many people make phones without cameras in them nowadays. That's probably a bad example. Stuff comes and goes. How many iPads have we now had? 2. iPods are about 5. Yeah, okay. It changes very, very quickly the way Apple does its planning. Depends an awful lot on this stuff. The dividing line between phones and computers is getting ever narrower. I pulled the BlackBerry out of my pocket the other day and showed it to you don't show it to the kids anymore because they know the answers to these things. I showed it to my mum and I said, is that a computer or a phone? She hadn't got a clue. I said, that's a shame because I don't know either. All the stuff that's going out there affects the way you're going to plan your business. You need to take it into account when you're writing your plan. Some of it isn't just going to affect the way you do your planning and your objective setting. Some of it might even affect the way you set yourselves up in the first place. Remember last time we talked about different ways of organising your marketing. There's all sorts of different ways of conducting yourself as a company. It might mean, for example, very interesting, the trend for off-sourcing engineering development and to places like India and China, where the workforce are fantastically educated, immensely able, and cost a whole lot less. The trend for offshoring call centres for the same sorts of reasons. I now sense this is being replaced by an opposite trend to onshore it all again, because for all the costs you're going to save by doing these things in remote places where the incremental labour costs are much lower, you lose because of communications problems and actual proper service that's needed by actual real customers. So an awful lot of companies I know are now desperately trying to bring back on into the UK things like software writing, because you can actually control it better and get much closer links between what the customers want and what the code writers are actually doing. I call that a driver of organisational change because of the way it works in the marketplace. I think you'll find that these things are coming back onshore again. Might be wrong. Might still be going offshore. It's still changing organisational structures and the way we do things. The way we behave nowadays, there's the fallout from all this phone hacking stuff. That's going to spread its tentacles all over the place in terms of we are suddenly going to have to be properly serious about ethical behaviour, I think. Watch this space. Who knows? It's going to pop up. It's not just one newspaper, is it? We all, as companies, some of us will be more advanced than others about things like carbon footprints. I know plenty of companies who still can't spell carbon or footprint. Just haven't been able, they're so busy putting out fires and doing primary stuff, they haven't got to that. But we're all facing it. Some of us, the big employers will probably have more of an imperative to do something about this. We have to behave differently because, and we even have to organise ourselves differently because this has come on the agenda in the last 5 or 10 years. Because because competition is harder, it gives us more incentive to participate in markets that are not just our home market, and it gives us, depending on the nature of the business, there is more incentive to play in mainland Europe, English-speaking remote territories like America and Australia, Far East. If you count India and China, I forget what percentage of the world's population lives in India and China combined, but it's something like half. That's half the market in the world for your stuff. And it's suddenly accessible, and they're suddenly spending money. And I learned not long ago, who do you think the biggest consumer, which country is the biggest consumer of cars in the world? Most cars sold per year, which country? Have a guess. America, could be. It's changed recently. It's not Russia. China. Amazing. Guess which country makes more cars than any other country? America, Germany, Russia, China. The world is changing. More cars are made in China. Maybe we don't see them all over here. And maybe I'm wrong. But I heard it on the BBC, so it must be true. Huh? Whether it's true or not, it's an illustration. The world is changing. Okay, why aren't we doing business in China? That's where most of the people on the planet are. We've got the opportunity. The world has changed. Now the challenge is much more to do business that way. It might not apply to small law firms in East Anglia, but I generalise. Okay, yeah. You go to India. Is there a smaller law firm on the planet than yours? So how many lawyers do you have? 100? 3? 40? So you're not a colossal practice, and you're doing business in India. Brilliant. I rest my case.
You could also say that globalisation could clash with, the social responsibility.
Could do, yes. Yeah, thank you. Yes, these things are probably mutually incompatible, just to make life a bit harder. But you have to find your way around it. And whose job is it? Yours, ladies and gentlemen. We're making the plans now. So we have to take all this stuff. I've put under the heading of organisational change. It changes. It's more than just the way you make the plans. It's the way you set out your stall, the way you set out your business. Do you have lawyers physically in India? Not yet. Soon. Maybe. All sorts of interesting questions. But it raises instantly these questions. How do you engage with Indian clients? Have you got representatives there? How do you reach them? How do you find them? Or is it just about trade between...
More like trade.
Okay, but their business coming in. Okay, so you set yourselves out. Yeah, but where are we? Within 3 years, you'll have somebody on the ground in India. Bet you. Because all the other law firms will be copying you. And you've got to stay a step ahead. So these are the sorts of challenges. And you might not be used to doing this stuff in your day job, but for the purpose of the assignment, you're allowed to pretend to be marketing manager. The job of marketing is to get these plans made. just in case the managing director doesn't feel like it. Okay? So it's up to you to plan the responses to this stuff. Good. Sorry, that was something of a rant. Oh, another one that is really important. Anybody here work for a PLC? No? When you do, when you're, most of you then work for partnerships or limited partnerships. What are you, an LLP or limited company? Don't know, you might not know.
Yeah,
Doesn't matter. You've got some options. A lot of us will be working for limited companies. If you ever float on the stock exchange, you become a PLC. You suddenly get a whole load of other stakeholders called institutional investors, and you've got to be very nice to them all of a sudden. And they are much nastier to deal with than your private shareholders, which all you've got to deal with. And you've got to do things like investor relations. And your managing director and your chief financial officer will spend all their time wandering around the City of London being nice to investors. And you're going to have investor relations people and different sorts of corporate communications. That happens just by virtue of becoming a PLC. So it's another driver of organisational change, by the way. One of my clients, I work mainly with limited companies, but I've got a PLC that I'm working for at the moment. And it's a different environment. The whole thing behaves differently because we've got to keep an eye on investors, because we've got to report to them every 3 months, because. You behave differently. Quite uncomfortable if you're not used to it, I have to admit. Good. One more thing just to finish off today. Getting a bit wider, well actually what we're really doing is just drilling down into the external and internal forces, and we're drifting into audit space, which is what I want to take up next time. I just want to have a look particularly, I want to start classifying these external and internal forces. We're going to talk much more about this next time, but there's a point here which it turns out to be incredibly easy to misunderstand, so I want to have one go at it today, and then we'll have another go next time. When we're talking about external forces, it's helpful to divide them into what we call macro and what we call micro. And on the whole, macro, if you think of these are the forces at large which apply to everybody. And if it was you and your competition and your other two competitors sitting next to each other, on the whole you'd agree on these things. Pastel, yes, political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and what's the other L? Legal? Why isn't it up there? Doesn't matter. And sometimes ethical, sometimes cultural, pastelic, whatever you want to call it. It's these, the stuff, the macroeconomic stuff, the stuff at large, as it were, is one set of forces. The other set are to do with the way you see the market, the way you see your customers, the way there's competitors, the way the industry is organised, the way they make their decisions, the world of their suppliers and all the other. This is how the market works, if you like. Usually referred to as the micro part of the external audit, sometimes known as a task environment. If you come across that phrase, that's synonymous with the micro label for the external influences. And the conventional view of this, by the way, is we've got to focus on competitors, because Michael Porter did a great piece of work on Porter's 5 competitive forces, which is fine, but that idea is not at all invalid, but it belongs 40 years ago, or whenever he wrote it. I think it was about 1970 or 80. I promise you, in all the worlds you look in, just like Lewis Hamilton, if you spend all your time looking out of your rear view mirrors at what the competition are doing, you're going to crash. Look out the front. And what I really want to focus on next time, lest I forget, is these two things. What's the market doing? What do your customers want from you? I don't care. If you've got to do one thing, find out what your customers want and ignore your competition. Preferably do both, but do not, whatever you do, ignore that stuff. And I'm going to big that up properly next time. And we'll do more of this next time. This is the thing that we misunderstand. So I'll say it once now and then about once every 10 minutes, next session. These is all to do with the external influences. It goes macro and micro. It apparently is very easy to confuse micro with internal. Micro is not internal. Micro is part of external. Internal is a different set of stuff. And these sorts of things, it's about capabilities, assets, your portfolio of products, it's your culture, it's your relationships, it's this stuff which all belongs inside. We'll have a look at that next time. The challenge with this is there's about 16 different models for it, which is about 15 more than you need. And the question is which one is more appropriate for your worlds, and we'll take a look at that in the next session or the one after. That is very good. Thank you. As ever, I've overshot a little bit. Next time we will get into what they call the marketing audit and strategic outcomes. That will be session 3. We're already a quarter of the way through, folks. Scary. Mainly next time we'll look at the external environment, the external audit, and probably session 4 we'll look at internal stuff. 8 altogether. This is number 2, just finished. There are 4 sections in the syllabus, and roughly we spend 2 sections on each, although towards the end the last section is pretty short, but that's where we'll drill down and spend a bit more time looking at the assignment in more detail. Or whatever else is interesting. If you want to divert me with particular questions, that's great, because it's nice to go around the syllabus a bit, and I want to go off syllabus from time to time just to show that there is more to life than just syllabus, because this is about marketing, it's about real life, and we like reading around the subject, don't we? Is that all right? I will see you next time. Look forward to it. Thank you for coming. Until next time, if you want questions at any time, you can do it in the room or come and wait behind afterwards. It always takes me a while to close down. Thank you very much. See you next time.